The dust hung in the late October air, a golden haze that tasted of dry corn stalks and diesel exhaust. It was 1969, and the harvest was a beast you wrestled from sunup to sundown. Arthur Jensen felt the grit between his teeth as he stood by the fence line, his knuckles stained with grease from a morning spent coaxing his old combiner to life. Across the gravel road, Bob Miller's brand-new John Deere 6600 sat gleaming, its paint so fresh it looked wet. It was a monster of a machine, a testament to the new age of farming, an age financed by the First National Bank of Cedar County. Bob himself leaned against the massive rear tire of his machine, a smug grin playing on his lips as he watched Art tighten the last bolt on the grain head of his Massey Harris 90 Special. The Massey was a product of the 50s, a stout, reliable machine with a simple, rugged design. Its paint was a faded red, weathered by 2 decades of Iowa sun and snow. To Bob, and most of the younger farmers in the county, it was a relic. "Still fighting with that museum piece, Art?" Bob called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet road. A couple of his hired hands, young guys barely out of high school, snickered behind him. Art didn't look up. He gave the bolt a final firm turn with his 3/4-inch wrench, feeling the satisfying bite as the thread seated. He knew this machine. He knew every clatter, every groan, every shimmy. He'd bought it used for cash 10 years ago and had rebuilt the Hercules engine himself one winter. It didn't owe him a dime. "She'll do the job, Bob," Art said, his voice low and even. He wiped his hands on an oily rag he kept tucked in his back pocket. Bob pushed himself off the tire and sauntered to the edge of the road, kicking at a loose stone. He gestured with his chin toward Art's field, 160 acres of some of the heaviest corn the county had seen in years. The stalks were thick, the ears heavy. It was a good year, a profitable year if you could get it out of the field. "That old girl might have been something in her day," Bob said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But that combine won't handle this field. The corn's too thick, too wet. You'll be plugging that cylinder every 20 feet. You'll be leaving half your profit on the ground." Art finally straightened up and looked Bob in the eye. He was a decade older than Bob, his face a road map of sun and worry lines, but his shoulders were still broad from a lifetime of real labor. "She's paid for, Bob. Every nut and bolt. Can you say the same about that big yellow toy over there?" Bob's grin tightened. "This toy, as you call it, is an investment. It's progress. It'll cut this whole section in a day and a half. You'll be lucky to be done by Thanksgiving with that thing. The bank understands progress, Art. They're happy to lend to men who are looking to the future, not stuck in the past." He pointed at the Massey's narrow 4-row corn head. "Look at that thing. 4 rows. I'm running 8. I do twice the work in half the time. That's efficiency. That's how you make money in this business now." Art glanced from his old red machine to the gleaming green giant across the road. He could hear the hum of its diesel engine, a smooth, powerful purr compared to the throaty, mechanical roar his Hercules engine would soon make. There was no denying the new machine's capability. It was bigger, faster, more comfortable with its enclosed cab and radio. But Art saw something else. He saw a mountain of debt. He saw monthly payments that were bigger than his entire property tax bill for the year. He saw a man shackled to the bank, a man who had to run flat out every single year just to keep the wolf from the door. "There's more to farming than speed, Bob," Art said quietly. "There's staying power." Bob just laughed, a loud booming sound that echoed off the grain silos down the road. "Staying power? You call this staying power? This is stagnation, Art. While you're out here patching up junk, I'll be at the dealer looking at a new 4-wheel drive tractor. You can't get ahead by standing still." He turned to walk back to his combine, calling over his shoulder, "Don't come crying to me when that thing finally blows up and you're staring at a field of rotten corn." Art watched him go. He felt the familiar sting of doubt, the same doubt he heard in the whispers at the co-op and the feed store. "Old man Jensen," they'd say. "Too stubborn to modernize. Too cheap to get a loan." They saw his weathered equipment and his mended overalls, and they saw a man falling behind. They didn't see the deed to his farm, free and clear, locked in the safe in his house. They didn't see his savings account at that same bank Bob was so proud to be in debt to. He ran a hand over the faded red paint of his Massey. It was warm from the afternoon sun. He knew its weaknesses. He knew the main drive belt had a tendency to slip if he pushed it too hard in damp conditions. He knew the number 3 cylinder sometimes fouled a plug if he let it idle too long. But he also knew how to fix it, with his own 2 hands and the tools in his shed. He wasn't dependent on a dealer's mechanic charging $30 an hour. When his machine broke, his checkbook stayed in his pocket. Before we go any further into this, I have to ask you folks something. Down in the comments, let me know what you think. Is it smarter to run old, paid-for equipment that you can fix yourself, even if it's slower? Or is it better to take on debt for the newest, most efficient machinery to get the job done faster? I've seen it go both ways, and I'd be interested to hear what you all have to say about it. Art climbed up the ladder to the operator's platform. There was no enclosed cab, just a simple seat and a steering wheel, exposed to the wind and the dust. He turned the key, and the big 6-cylinder Hercules engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a plume of dark smoke. The whole machine vibrated, a living thing waking from its slumber. The sound was raw, powerful, and completely mechanical. It was the sound of work. He engaged the separator and the header, the chains and belts beginning their rhythmic clatter. He looked across the road. Bob was already in his field, the big 8-row head swallowing corn at an incredible pace, a cloud of dust and chaff billowing behind him. Art took a deep breath, pushed the throttle forward, and eased his old Massey Harris into the first rows of his own field. The battle had begun. The first couple of years of the new decade, the early 70s, were a trial for Art. The winter of 71 was particularly brutal, and when he went to start the Massey for the soybean harvest the following fall, he heard a sound no farmer ever wants to hear, a sharp crack followed by the sickening grind of metal on metal. He shut it down instantly, his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. He knew, even before he climbed down, that it was serious. He spent the next 2 days pulling the machine into his shop, a converted dairy barn with a concrete floor he'd poured himself. Using a chain hoist hung from a heavy oak beam, he and his teenage son, David, carefully lifted the big Hercules engine out of its cradle. The diagnosis was grim. A connecting rod had snapped. It had punched a fist-sized hole in the side of the engine block and chewed up the crankshaft journal beyond repair. The man at the parts counter in town just shook his head. "Art, you can't get a new block for one of these anymore. Not for a Hercules JXD. You might find a used one at a salvage yard, but it's a long shot." For a week, Art called every salvage yard in a 3-state radius. Nothing. The whispers in town grew louder. Heard Jensen's combine finally gave up the ghost, they'd say over coffee at the diner. Now he'll have to go into debt like a real farmer. Bob Miller drove by his farm slowly one afternoon, a new International 1066 tractor trailing behind him, its dual rear wheels churning up the gravel. He didn't stop, but the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. Art felt the pressure closing in. The beans were ready, and every day they sat in the field was a risk. A hailstorm, a wet snow, and his entire year's profit would be lost. The bank manager called, offering a pre-approved loan for a new machine. "We can have a new John Deere out to you by Friday, Art," he'd said, his voice smooth as butter. "No money down for farmers with your kind of equity." That night, Art sat at his kitchen table, staring at the loan application, the smell of his wife Mary's pot roast doing little to soothe his nerves. He hated the thought of it. 30 years he'd been farming, and he'd never owed the bank a dime for equipment. It was a point of pride, a principle he'd inherited from his father, who had lost everything in the 30s because of a bank loan he couldn't pay. "Maybe it's time, Art," Mary said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe Bob is right. You can't fight the future." He looked at her, at the worry in her eyes, and then back at the loan papers. He was about to pick up the pen when his son David came in, his hands black with grease. "Dad, I was looking at the old Farmall M," David said, his voice full of the nervous energy of a 16-year-old with an idea. "The engine in that, it's a 4-cylinder, but the bell housing pattern, it looks almost the same as the Hercules." Art stared at him. The Farmall M was his father's tractor, a 1948 model that he now used for light-duty work, raking hay or pulling a wagon. Its engine was smaller, less powerful, but it was famously reliable. An idea, crazy and desperate, began to form in his mind. It was impossible. The engine mounts were different. The clutch linkage wouldn't line up. The radiator wouldn't fit. It was a fool's errand, and yet it was better than signing that paper. For the next 10 days, the lights in Art's shop burned late into the night. He and David became a team, a whirlwind of wrenches, cutting torches, and welding rods. They pulled the engine from the Farmall M, a greasy but solid block of red iron. As they suspected, it wasn't a direct fit. They spent a whole day fabricating new engine mounts from 1/4-inch steel plate, measuring, cutting, and welding until the new engine sat perfectly aligned with the transmission shaft. The flywheel from the Hercules engine was bigger, heavier. They had to drill new holes in it to match the bolt pattern of the Farmall's crankshaft. A delicate operation, done on an ancient drill press, using cutting oil and a whole lot of patience. The clutch was a nightmare. They ended up combining parts from both machines, creating a hybrid linkage that was ugly but functional. They had to cut a new hole in the firewall for the exhaust and weld the old radiator brackets onto the Massey's frame to accommodate the smaller Farmall radiator. The whole county thought he'd gone mad. Neighbors would slow down as they drove by, staring at the Frankenstein creation taking shape in his open workshop. It became the local joke. Art Jensen was trying to power a combine with a tractor engine. Bob Miller told everyone at the co-op that Art had finally lost his mind, that he was too proud to admit defeat. On the 11th day, it was done. The red Farmall engine sat nestled in the Massey's frame, a tangle of custom-made fuel lines and wiring harnesses connecting it to the combine systems. With a deep breath, Art climbed into the operator's seat. He turned the key. The engine turned over, caught, and settled into a familiar, rhythmic pop, 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 the signature sound of a Farmall M. It sounded strange, underpowered, sitting in the belly of the big combine. He engaged the separator. The belts tightened, the machine groaned, but it began to turn. The smaller engine strained under the load, but it held. That afternoon, under the skeptical gaze of half the neighborhood, Art Jensen drove his Massey Harris, now powered by the heart of a 1948 Farmall tractor, into his soybean field. It was slow. He had to run a full gear lower than he did with the old engine. He couldn't push it as hard, and he had to be careful not to overload the cylinder. But it worked. The headers cut the beans, the augers fed them in, and clean, golden soybeans began to fill the grain tank. He worked from dawn until well after dusk, the single headlight of the combine cutting a lonely path through the darkness. He finished his harvest 2 weeks late, but he finished it. And when he sold the crop, the check went into his pocket, not the bank's. He hadn't made as much as Bob Miller, but he hadn't spent a penny on loan interest either. He had survived. The mid-70s rolled in on a wave of prosperity that few could have predicted. The Russians started buying American grain in massive quantities, and prices shot through the roof. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled. Land values soared. The government and the banks urged farmers to expand. "Plant fence row to fence row," said the Secretary of Agriculture. "Get big or get out." For men like Bob Miller, it was a golden age. The high prices justified his debt. He used his massive profits as leverage for even bigger loans. He bought the 200 acres bordering Art's farm to the east, paying a price that made the old-timers gasp. To work the new land, he traded in his John Deere 6600 for a brand-new 7700 turbo, a machine that dwarfed even his last one. It had air conditioning, a stereo, and a grain tank that could hold 200 bushels. He bought a new Steiger four-wheel drive tractor for his fall tillage, a green beast that could pull a 12-bottom plough and cost more than Art's entire farm was worth just a decade earlier. Bob's operation became the model of modern farming in the county. His yard was a neat and tidy showcase of new, gleaming green and red machinery. He built massive grain bins to store his crop, playing the markets for the highest price. He was featured in a Farm Journal article, pictured leaning against his new combine, talking about aggressive expansion and leveraging assets. He was the future. Art, meanwhile, continued his steady, cautious pace. The high grain prices were a blessing, and for the first time in his life, he had a significant cushion of cash. But instead of leveraging it, he used it to secure his position. He paid off the last of the mortgage on his original quarter section. He bought new tires for his John Deere 4020. He put a new roof on the barn. He invested in tiling a low-lying section of his field that had always been too wet, a permanent improvement that would pay dividends for decades. His neighbors saw it as a lack of vision. "Can you believe it?" they'd say. "Art Jensen's got cash in his pocket for the first time in his life, and he spends it on drain tile. Bob Miller bought a whole farm." When the 80-acre parcel to his north came up for sale, an estate sale from a farmer who had passed away, Art went to the auction. Bob Miller was there, expecting to snap it up to connect his other properties. The bidding was brisk. When it reached a level Art thought was fair, he started bidding, using the cash he had saved. Bob, confident and arrogant, kept raising him. But Art was relentless. He knew his limit, a number he had calculated based on the land's real, productive value, not the inflated bubble price. The bidding passed that number, and Art quietly dropped his hand. Bob Miller bought the farm, paying nearly a third more than it was worth, the purchase financed, of course, by the bank. Art went home with his money still in his pocket. He was disappointed, but not defeated. He was seen as a relic, a man out of step with the times. While other farmers talked about bushels per acre and return on investment, Art talked about cost per bushel and debt-to-asset ratios. He was a man playing a different game. While Bob Miller and the others were playing for the jackpot, Art was playing to stay at the table. He still ran the Massey Harris combine, its Red Farm all-engine faithfully chugging along. Every year it looked smaller and more pathetic next to the ever-larger machines that populated the county. The joke about his Farmal Massey had become a local legend, a cautionary tale parents told their sons about the dangers of being too stubborn. But Art saw things the others didn't. He listened to the radio reports, not just the grain prices, but the financial news. He heard whispers of inflation, of the Federal Reserve getting worried. He saw the interest rates on his savings account statements tick up, from 5% to 6%, then to 8%. He knew that if the rate for savers was going up, the rate for borrowers must be going up too. One afternoon in the late summer of 1979, he was at the co-op picking up some hydraulic fluid. Bob Miller was there, holding court by the counter, bragging about the new center pivot irrigation system he was installing. "It's a variable rate loan," Bob announced proudly to the assembled farmers. "The banker said it's the best way to go. The rate floats with the market. When the economy is hot, it goes up a little, but it'll come back down. It's the modern way to finance." The co-op manager, a cautious old man named Frank, looked over his glasses. "Those variable rates can be tricky, Bob. I've seen them bite a man before." Bob just laughed. "You sound like Art Jensen, Frank. You got to spend money to make money. The prices are only going one way, up." Art paid for his oil and left without a word. As he drove home in his old pickup truck, a storm was brewing on the western horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, and the air was heavy and still. It felt like a change was coming, a change that had nothing to do with the weather. He knew that Bob's floating interest rate was tied to something called the prime rate, and Art had heard on the radio that a new chairman of the Federal Reserve had just been appointed, a man named Paul Volcker, a man who had promised to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. Art didn't know much about high finance, but he knew one thing. When something was floating, it could just as easily sink. And he had a feeling a lot of his neighbors were about to find out just how cold the water could be. The year 1980 began not with a bang, but with the slam of a door. It was the door to the grain markets, shut tight by a presidential embargo against the Soviet Union. The news crackled over the AM radio in Art's pickup, a cold, impersonal voice from Washington, D.C., sealing the fate of farmers 1,000 miles away. The price of corn, which had been a source of giddy optimism, plummeted overnight. It fell by 1/3 in a week, then another 10 cents, then another. The wave of prosperity that had lifted everyone crashed back into a sea of uncertainty. For Art, it was a blow. A significant portion of his income vanished into thin air. But his costs were fixed and low. He had no payments to make. He tightened his belt, put off plans to repaint the house, and told Mary they'd be eating more chicken and less beef. It was a hardship, but it wasn't a crisis. For Bob Miller, it was a catastrophe. He was leveraged to the hilt, his entire operation built on the assumption of $3 corn. His massive loan payments were calculated on that price. Suddenly, his income was slashed, but his expenses, the interest on his land, his new combine, his Steiger tractor, remained immense. The first cracks began to show. The confident swagger was replaced by a nervous energy. He was on the phone constantly, his voice tight with frustration as he argued with the grain elevator manager. That fall, during soybean harvest, the second blow fell. Art was in his field, the steady pop, pop, pop of the farm-all engine in his Massey, a comforting rhythm, when he saw Bob's giant 7700 turbo grind to a halt in the middle of a pass. It just sat there, silent, a massive green monument to inaction. Art watched for a while as Bob climbed in and out of the cab, slamming the door, kicking at the tires. After an hour, the dealer's service truck arrived. Art saw the mechanic, a young man with a multimeter and a laptop-sized diagnostic tool, scratching his head. They worked on it for the rest of the afternoon. As dusk settled, Art finished his last pass and drove his combine back to the shed. The service truck was still in Bob's field, its yellow emergency lights flashing in the twilight. The next day, Art saw them loading the combine's massive grain head onto a flatbed trailer. He ran into Frank at the co-op later that week. "What happened with Bob's combine?" Art asked. Frank shook his head, polishing the counter with a rag. Something in the hydrostatic drive, a main hydraulic pump, went out. Took out a whole bank of electronic sensors with it. The parts are on back order from Moline. They told him it could be 2 weeks, maybe 3. And the bill, I heard them talking. It's going to be north of $5,000. $5,000. It was more than Art had paid for his entire combine 10 years ago. For the next 3 weeks, Bob Miller's magnificent high-tech machine sat idle while his soybeans waited in the field. A week of rain came, turning the ground to muck and spotting the beans. When he finally got the combine back, the crop was damaged, the yield was down, and the price was still in the gutter. Art, meanwhile, had finished his own harvest, done his fall tillage with his old 40-20, and put his equipment away for the winter, his checkbook untouched. But the real storm, the one Art had sensed on the horizon, was the invisible one brewing in the nation's financial centers. Paul Volcker, true to his word, began to wage his war on inflation. He did it by raising interest rates, first to 12%, then 15%. The numbers on the evening news were abstract, meaningless to most people, but to anyone with a variable rate loan, they were a death sentence. The spring of 1981 was when the notices started appearing. They were tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse and printed in the classified section of the Cedar County Chronicle. Foreclosure auctions. At first, it was just 1 or 2, farmers on the fringe who had always been overextended. But as the prime rate climbed to an unthinkable 18, then 20, then 21.5%, the trickle became a flood. Bob Miller's variable rate loan, the one he had bragged about, had become a python, wrapping itself around his operation and squeezing. His payments doubled, then tripled. He was paying more in interest every month than his own father had paid for his first 80 acres. The bank manager, the same man who had taken him out for steak dinners and called him the future of farming, now wouldn't return his calls. He only sent letters, formal and cold, filled with words like delinquent and default. Art saw the desperation in Bob's face. The man had lost weight. His eyes were hollow. He drove his equipment too fast, worked with a frantic, reckless energy, as if he could outrun the numbers on the page. One day, Art saw him trying to get his big Steiger tractor started. The engine was turning over slow, the batteries clearly weak. In a fit of rage, Bob jumped from the cab, grabbed a 5-pound hammer from his toolbox, and slammed it into the side of the tractor's grill, leaving a deep, ugly dent in the perfect green paint. It was the sound of a man breaking. Art survived the crisis by being invisible. With no debt, the high interest rates didn't affect him. In fact, they helped. The interest on his savings account, the money he'd kept in his pocket instead of buying that 80-acre parcel, was earning him a small but steady income. The low grain prices hurt, but his cost of production was a fraction of his neighbor's. His old farmall Massey didn't ask for expensive parts. When a bearing went out on the separator fan, he didn't call a dealer. He drove to the parts store, paid $8 for a new bearing, and spent 2 hours in his shop pressing the old one out and the new one in. He was back in the field by lunchtime. He watched as the community fractured around him. Families who had farmed the same land for 100 years were forced to sell. The auctioneer's chant became the soundtrack of the countryside. Art saw men he'd known his whole life, proud and capable men, openly weeping as their heritage was sold off, piece by piece, to strangers. He and Mary took food to neighbors who were struggling, offered help where they could, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. The inevitable day came in the fall of 1982. The notice was in the paper, a full-page ad. The assets of Miller Farms, by order of the First National Bank of Cedar County, to be sold at public auction. The list was a testament to a fallen empire, a John Deere 7700 turbo combine, a Steiger Panther thread tractor, an International 1066, a full line of tillage equipment, grain trucks, wagons, and 360 acres of prime farmland to be sold in 3 parcels. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a bitter wind that whipped across the harvested fields. The entire county was there. It wasn't a celebration, it was a wake. Bob Miller's gleaming machines were lined up in a row in his yard, each with a number taped to its side. They looked like showpieces, too perfect to be sold under such grim circumstances. Bob himself stood near the farmhouse, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his. He looked like a ghost. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound and terrible shame. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, as the auctioneer started the sale. Art stood at the back of the crowd, his son David, now a young man of 21, beside him. David had deferred college for a year to help on the farm, seeing the crisis firsthand. He was quiet, watchful, his father's son. "It's not right, Dad," David whispered, watching as Bob's new combine sold for less than half of what he owed on it. He did everything they told him to do. The government, the banks, they all said get bigger. They did, Art said, his voice low. But the house always wins in the end, son. You can't bet the farm because sooner or later the house will take it. The equipment sold quickly, for pennies on the dollar. The market was flooded with used machinery from other farm auctions. Then came the land. The first parcel, the 200 acres Bob had bought during the boom years, sold to an out-of-state insurance company. The second parcel, the 80 acres Art had bid on, went to another investor from the city. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel, the original 80 acres, the home place, with the house, the barns, and the machine shed. The Miller family homestead. The bidding started low. A few local farmers made tentative bids. Art saw Bob flinch with every call. This was the land his grandfather had broken with a team of horses. This was the yard where he had learned to drive a tractor. Art watched, his heart heavy. This wasn't victory. It was a tragedy. He thought of Bob's laughter across the fence line years ago, the condescending remarks about his museum piece. There was no satisfaction in seeing him brought this low. There was only a deep, abiding sorrow for the hubris of it all. The bidding stalled. The auctioneer tried to coax another bid from the crowd. "It's a good farm, folks. Good buildings, a good home." Art felt a nudge at his elbow. It was David. "Dad," he said, his voice urgent. "You have the money from the savings. You could buy it." Art looked at his son, and then across the crowd at Bob Miller, who had finally broken, his face buried in his wife's shoulder. He thought of his own father, who had lost everything in the Depression. He had spent his whole life trying to avoid that fate. But maybe survival wasn't just about protecting yourself. Maybe it was about preserving something for others too. He raised his hand. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I have a new bid," he called out. A silence fell over the crowd. Everyone turned to look. Old man Jensen, the man who never spent a dime, was bidding on the Miller homestead. The investor who had bought the other parcel raised his hand again. Art counted immediately. They went back and forth, the price climbing. Art kept his hand up, his face grim. He knew his limit, the real value, not the speculative one. He bid that number, his final offer. The auctioneer looked at the investor. The man shook his head. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "To Arthur Jensen." A murmur went through the crowd. Art didn't acknowledge them. He walked through the parting sea of people, straight toward Bob Miller. Bob looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of disbelief and a flicker of old resentment. "You came here to gloat, Art," he choked out, "to finally prove you were right?" Art stopped in front of him. "No, Bob," he said, his voice steady. "I came here to be a neighbor." He pulled out his checkbook. "I'm not a landlord. I want you to stay. We'll work out a rental agreement, a fair one. You can rent the house and the farmstead from me, and when you get back on your feet, we can talk about you buying it back. This is your home. It should stay that way." Bob stared at him, speechless. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a dawning, painful gratitude. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, the tears he'd been holding back finally streaming down his face. Later that afternoon, as the last of the buyers hauled away their purchases and the crowd dispersed, Art walked through the machine shed. It was almost empty, with just a few old tools and oil stains on the floor, marking where the giant machines had once sat. But in the back corner, covered in a dusty tarp, was a shape he recognized. He pulled the tarp off. It was an old John Deere Model A from the late 40s, its green paint faded, its tires cracked. It was the tractor Bob had learned to drive on, his father's tractor, which he'd kept for sentimental reasons. It hadn't been part of the bank's collateral. When Bob came into the shed, Art was looking at the old tractor. "She's a good old machine," Art said. "Simple, reliable." "My dad bought it new," Bob said, his voice hoarse. "Does it run?" Art asked. "It did a few years ago. Needs a battery, and the carburetor probably needs cleaning." Art nodded. "David and I will come over tomorrow. We'll help you get it running." He looked at Bob, man to man. "You start with this. It's paid for. It doesn't owe you a thing. You start from there, and you build back slow. You build back smart." In that dusty, empty machine shed, surrounded by the ghosts of his ambition, Bob Miller finally understood. The lesson hadn't been about the size of the combine or the speed of the harvest. It had been about the foundation. His had been built on the shifting sands of debt. Art's was built on solid rock. The years that followed were a slow healing for the community. The farm crisis left deep scars, but the land endured. Art Jensen became something of a quiet legend. The farmers who had once mocked him now sought his advice. They'd stop by his workshop, not to talk about the markets, but about how to rebuild a transmission, or how to get by on last year's income. He never preached, never said, "I told you so." He just shared what he knew, offering a helping hand and a steady perspective. Bob Miller, with Art's help, started over. He rented the homestead and farmed it with the old John Deere A and a small collection of used equipment he bought for cash. It was a hard, humbling life, but for the first time, he was his own man. Not the bank's. He and Art became friends, a friendship forged in the crucible of failure and grace. Art's son, David, eventually took over the farm. He didn't run it exactly like his father. He bought a newer, more efficient planter with a loan from the bank, but it was a small, sensible loan he could pay off in 3 years. He used a computer to track his expenses down to the penny. He embraced new technology, but he did it with his father's caution, his father's discipline. The old Massey Harris combine, with its red farmall heart, was finally retired in 1989. It had served for 20 years under Art's care, a decade of that with its transplanted engine. It hadn't been fast or pretty, but it had been faithful. It had seen them through the best of times and the worst of times. David wanted to sell it for scrap, but Art wouldn't let him. "No," Art said. "We're going to park it in the back of the machine shed. I want it there to remind us." One crisp autumn evening, years later, Art stood with his young grandson, watching David operate a new but modestly sized combine in the field. The machine had a comfortable cab and a digital monitor, but it was paid for. "Grandpa?" the boy asked, pointing to the back of the dark shed where the hulking shape of the old Massey Harris rested. "Why do you keep that old broken combine?" Art put a hand on the boy's shoulder and looked out at the fields, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The land was his, free and clear. His son was carrying on the legacy. His family was secure. "It's not broken, son," Art said softly, a lifetime of wisdom in his voice. "That old combine, it's the freest machine we ever owned. It never made us the most money, but it made sure the money we earned was ours. It didn't just harvest the corn. It harvested our independence."